Shalom, it's Chris with firstcenturychristianity.net. Thank you for giving me some time to go over the Word of God. We would like to invite you to drop in on our Zoom. This message and a lot of the messages that we post here are re-recordings of what happened live during our services. In the live versions, we have a lot of interaction. We have people talking back and forth and sharing their thoughts, and we have discussion time afterwards. So when these go out, you know, far and wide, I redo them to just, be sermons. But if you want to have some interaction, and if you want to be able to share your thoughts in real time, please drop in at 1 p.m. Central Time. The Zoom link is at firstcenturychristianity.net. We would love to have you. We would love to meet you. We would love to know who the people are who are watching these things, which are spread out all over the place. And please, if you are watching, please like and share it to help spread the gospel. So the story of David and Goliath is one that we very often quote to say that, oh, we favor the underdog. David was such an underdog. He was such a, come from behind. He had no chance. That's actually not what is happening in in 1 Samuel 17, 1 Samuel 17. That's actually not the whole story or the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. You should read 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 51 before listening to this, or while, or maybe after, so that things I say make sense. But there are two lessons, at least two lessons inside of the David and Goliath story that show us that he wasn't really uh, an underdog, uh, not nearly as much as we think, if at all. So the first are in verse 39 and verse 49 of 1 Samuel 17. In 39 it says, David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. David took them off. And then in verse 49, David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. So the first thing is that David was not stupid. He was wise, way beyond his years wise. The warriors that were afraid of Goliath kept looking at the battle on Goliath's terms. They looked at it as if they had to go toe to toe with the guy. Like they would have to be, because they were warriors too, but maybe they were like, Oscar de la Hoya getting in the ring with Mike Tyson, both at the height of their prime. Obviously, de la Hoya would not have a shot, even though he was a wonderful boxer. So they're looking at it from the wrong perspective. They're looking that they have to meet him on his turf and beat him on his terms. David doesn't do that. He doesn't do that at all. He doesn't wear the armor because if you're going to wear the armor, then that means you're expecting to get hit and survive. But if David being a smaller person, probably about 5'5", and Goliath being, maybe 8 feet tall or something to that effect, there's no way that David is going to withstand blows from the giant with or without the armor. And David couldn't move in the armor. So that's first thing is that he doesn't even wear the armor or wield the sword because David knows he has no shot fighting Goliath the way that Goliath wants to fight. And then uh, it's also prophetic for Saul to be dressing David in the king's armor. There's a lot to unpack there, but you understand that if David actually did wear the king's armor into battle, it shows that Saul was chicken. Saul was the king. The king is a military leader in all countries. In the West here, we have presidents and prime ministers now who take the place of kings, who are our civil leaders, but their primary job is the defense of the nation. So that a king is supposed to be the one to go out to battle first. So in this scenario, Saul is a big man. Saul is not a small person. He was large and good looking, and he should have been the one out meeting Goliath and taking up the the banner of Israel, and he wasn't doing it. So for him to offer David his armor, very insulting. Very, if David had done that, it would have been a huge slam. Um, but it's also prophetic because it's a premonition of Saul giving up his anointing and having that pass to David as well. The other part of this is that the stone, the stone. David didn't go to battle with bow, arrow, javelin, right, right. Or bow and, he could have done a bow and arrow, right? But he didn't do the javelin, didn't do the sword, he didn't do the spear, he didn't do the shield. He effectively shot Goliath. And Goliath isn't even that smart, which is why the rock went in, because there was nothing behind it. So David hits him, he shoots him, because there's no way he can go toe to toe. He doesn't put on the armor so that he stays nimble and that he can throw the rock. He couldn't do that if he was wearing all that heavy armor. And here's the next part of this in 1 Samuel 17:46 to 47. This day Yahweh will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will deliver you into our hands. This is really cocky, because David is already made up, already knows how he's going to win. He's going to use a slingshot. And he's telling Goliath, I'm not going to go up against you with a shield or a spear, and I'm still going to beat you. So the big dummy should have ducked. He should have seen it coming. So David was shrewd, and he was smart, and he actually put the battle in Yahweh's hands. He said he was just a vessel. He wasn't actually the one doing the fighting. This is where David has experience. David was preserved when he had to fight the bear and the lion. And then he went hand to hand with the bear and the lion. If Yahweh was going to take him out, he wouldn't have been able to defeat those wild beasts. So David didn't have armor at that time. So David has got confidence that Yahweh has already preserved him. He is shrewd to know that you don't go to war against a lion dressed like a warrior. You go as a nimble and quick, and you try to strike him from a distance. But the bottom line of all of it is that while David was shrewd and he was wise and he was brave, he didn't take the credit. He said the battle belonged to Yahweh. And so if Yahweh's on your side and you're on Yahweh's side, guess what? You're not actually an underdog. You're okay. So we have a similar situation with Gideon that happened before this, where Gideon defeats the Midian army with just 300 men using cunning. But Yahweh specifically made Gideon do that with a ridiculously small minority of people. Yahweh made them an underdog because he didn't want Israel to think that they had won by their own might. There's also some striking parallels with Gideon and David too, because Gideon was the least in his father's household, was not from a well-known clan. Both of those things come out in the David story, right? Well, who's Jesse, right? But Gideon trusted Yahweh, even after putting Yahweh to the test. He trusted Yahweh, and he made it. And one thing about Gideon, though, is that Yahweh had Gideon take down his dad's idol altars, false god altars, beforehand. So when he took the altars down, he did it at night because he was scared. The next morning, everybody knows. Well, what had he done? He had defiled the Midianite altars. So by doing that, it made Gideon the Midianites enemy number one. So it forced him to fight at that point. It's either fight or flight. And if you read that story, it talks about how the Israelites were hiding in the rocks and the cliffs from the Midianites because they were smote. They were in a very weak position because they stopped trusting Yahweh and they started going after the false gods. that's going to come in later. The Israelites were hiding in caves and rocks. You might even know where I'm going with that before I even get there. So these stories are all intertwined, but in a broad sense, they show us that if you're on the side of Yahweh, you're not the underdog. You're just you're not. Sometimes he does things with an overwhelming force, and sometimes he does things with an underwhelming force. But he does what he will do, and sometimes he does it in a way to make sure that everybody knows he is the one who gets the credit. So, why is our society infatuated with underdogs? And that's what's happening today in our modern parlance and modern times. Is that every time a small group of people gets attacked by a larger group of people, we take the side of the smaller group of people, right? We take the side of the underdogs. We're conditioned to do that. And we're conditioned because of the way that our country has functioned. So on the left here, we have General Washington, where during the Civil or Revolutionary War, we should have been dispatched with no effort whatsoever. The British, at the height of the Revolutionary War, the British had 52,000 regulars in on the continent, on here, but not over the whole continent, just the East Coast. And the British had an armada, and they were so big that the sun never set on the British Empire. That meant that even with their ancient ships and sailing ships, that they were so mighty that in a 24-hour period, somewhere on the globe, the sun was shining on territory that they controlled. They ruled the world. And their army was fierce and trained and ruthless, and that's how they ruled the world. And they had to go to battle with farmers who were using farm implements as weapons and who were using their grandpa's rifle and untrained, ragtag, non-supplied, and it wasn't just underdogs. It was absurd. The British had the world's largest navy. We barely had a navy, barely. The French didn't like the British, so they helped us, but we couldn't stop the British from landing their troops. That's why the 52,000 were over here. And so without much of a navy to speak of, just a couple of ships, and without a standing army that was trained, we were able to repel the global power of the day. That should not have happened whatsoever. And so our founding is from an underdog perspective. Then we go to World War One, which is the doughboys on the right side. And the World War One, we did have a military infrastructure before we entered that war because we were selling weapons to the Allies ahead of time. The president at the time said he was not going to get involved in the war over there, and then ultimately we had to get involved in the war over there. In 1917, we had 85,000 troops in France. 1 year later, we had 1.2 million men on the European continent to liberate Europe from the First World War. That ramp up is beyond absurd. We didn't have the population we have today. America was not even close to what we are today. We weren't some global power. Steamships were just in their infancy, and we were able to recruit, train, and equip and ship 1.2 million men into theater in order to win that war in a very short amount of time. And that's an absolute miracle. Again, it reinforces our underdog mentality and how we can just do whatever we want to do over here because nobody can mess with us. But we came home from World War One and we put it all away. We put the bombs and the guns and everything away, and everybody went back to normal, and we went into full-blown isolationism. We did not. We were tired of the Europeans. We came over here because we were tired of the Europeans. Now we've got how many hundreds of thousands of dead because of those guys. So we came over and became our own place. And when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, we were the 17th largest army on Earth. We were nothing. We had a navy in the Pacific. We had a navy. We were kind of helping out the Allies, but we were doing everything we could to stay out of that war, two fronts. And what happened? The bottom picture. And the bottom picture is the U.S., Canada, Britain, Aussie, the Allies landing on the beaches of Normandy. Hitler had taken all of Europe except for Britain, and he thought the battle was coming across the English Channel. Did not. Came from the beaches of Normandy, but he had turned the place into a complete fortress. They're giant guns and everything pointed out, and we were able to put 156,000 men on the beach at Normandy in a day. Do you understand? Even today, that would be incredibly difficult. To in the Revolution, we topped out at 48,000 troops in the colonial army total. In this war here, we put 156,000 men on the beach in a day. Largest mobilization in the history of mankind. Now, we had a partner in this that usually gets short shrift, and they'll come up later. But the USSR was also on the march. And they were coming from the north and from the east in order to pressure this. Hitler had just taken over too much stuff and spread his army too thin. But the USSR was able to do that to help out as well. And our paratroopers getting behind enemy lines to disable their offensive weapons ahead of time also helped. But this is a complete miracle that we were able to do that. And then we were able to start taking land and moving towards Berlin at lightning speed. It took millions and millions of people back home building out the military infrastructure, building the ships and sailing the ships and the armament, because the 156,000 men needed food, fuel, transport, weapons, resupplied, and we needed artillery, and we needed tanks, because we had to go up against the panzers. This can't be understated how much of an underdog we were, and we were able to do this. Then, because once we took that, we couldn't take war anymore. We should have gone after the Soviets after World War II, but we just didn't have it in us. The same ideology. Nazis were the National Socialist Party, a totalitarian leftist regime, and that's what the USSR was as well. And the USSR was also genocidal. But we were done with war. Time to carve up the world. And we erased 2 Japanese cities because the Japanese were incredibly tougher than the British. Not the British, than the Germans. The Japanese were not anything to be messed with. If we'd have tried to do a land invasion in Japan, it would have gone on for years at the cost of enormous life. So President Truman decided that he would bomb their cities. And what's interesting with that is the justification comes with the fact that we had to do it twice. They were that fierce of enemies. So after World War II, there's a big shift, partly because we chose to, and partly because due to necessity, we didn't draw down. Europeans have proven time and again that they simply cannot manage their continent, and they're constantly going to war and bickering with each other, and things spiraling out of control. And the Soviet Union was still there, and the Soviet Union had the ability to build that bomb too. And there are weapons of war everywhere. There's planes, tanks, howitzers in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, all over the Pacific. And so we had to stay. We didn't have a choice. The world had to have a policeman. And so the U.S. and our allies went into that agreement to actually maintain the peace. The other reason that we have to keep a giant military now is that if we can drop 156,000 people on a beach in a day, that means it can be done. That means somebody else can do it too. And today we have a foe called China, which has an enormous amount of spare people and ships galore that always sail between our nation and theirs due to commerce. Enormous ships that are bigger than 3 football stadiums and that you could just pack with all sorts of bad stuff and sail it wherever you wanted to sail it. So we stopped being the underdog. And the reason for that is justified in many different ways, but we became the good guy with all of the power. And we even act like it. Even Americans, we don't know any different. We've been raised over here inside of this country with our military protecting us and our way of life and our commerce, that we are absolutely arrogant and we don't even realize we are. But at the end of World War II, the United States became the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and the British Empire all at once, except we were going to be for defense only. And we're flawed. And that's the juxtaposition, is the fact that we are a flawed people. We weren't engineered to have a standing army because our forefathers knew a standing army would be misused. And so we've made huge mistakes in the world. But we always have to make the lesser of two evil choices. Because if we tried to come home today and pack it in, as some would say, some would like us to do, we would be overrun in a heartbeat. And now so this establishes our underdog mentality from the fact that we've come from behind in 3 places where we should not have come from behind. So we have an arrogance about us that think that we could just do whatever we want to do. But another thing that conditions us with this is our media and superheroes and in fantasy movies. In Star Trek, Star Wars, the second release of Star Wars, which was actually 1, 2, and 3, the bad guy, the Emperor, controlled and had built 2 giant armies that he was in charge of, that he was going to have fight each other, so that whichever side won, he still owned the universe. In that case, the bad guy was absolutely the overlord who controlled everything, and you have these ragtag group of rebels who constantly come from behind and overtake enormous star destroyers that they should not be able to win. That guerrilla warfare, that come from behind spirit, that movie is based on the history of the United States of America fighting against totalitarian regimes, which we did all the time. The Marvel movies are even stranger because they lose all the time and come back and defeat the overwhelming force. And in the superhero justice is evil because you could see here in Normandy where the bad guy, Hitler, killed millions of people trying to take all the land and executing all the Jews. We turn around and land and kill hundreds of thousands of people getting to Berlin, and he takes his own life at Eagle's Nest before we can get him. Well, that's the right answer. In the Marvel movies, your ticket to eternal life is to be the bad guy, because you could kill whole entire planets, and entire planets could fall, and hundreds of millions of people, and when the bad guys get them and they're going to execute them, they're like, no, we can't be like them. Well, yeah, dude, you can. And they never kill the bad guy. And the bad guys keep coming back. Well, when we see that same story play out over and over and over, we start to adopt that philosophy. But we need to use the Bible for our philosophy, just like the people on the screen did. When you chase down the bad guy army, you take the head off the snake and you put it to bed and you win. Our country has forgotten how to win a war since the landing of Normandy. And the other one that gets me is the Hunger Games, where the 120-pound gal defeats tons of athletic men and soldiers with a bow and arrow. It's just never going to happen. It seems like our society is addicted to making somebody as much the underdog as they possibly can. and having them come from behind doing what? Doing what Goliath wanted David to do. Going and beating them at their own game. They don't even beat them in a different fashion. They always have to go toe to toe and win. And then we get to sports. And this is another misnomer about underdogs because we think we're rooting for the underdogs when um, I don't really watch college basketball, but it happens a lot when a team that's 10th ranked or 15th ranked ends up getting the championship or getting into the semis. And so everybody's like, wow, that's great. We're rooting for the underdogs. But they're not really underdogs. These are men who have been playing basketball since they were children and they are trained athletes. And it finally clicked at the right time. Or their coach came up with a really good idea. The same thing in tennis. When a tennis player, when there's a mighty Novak Djokovic, or when Pete Sampras was the mighty one on the top of the hill, or Federer, and some new young person would come up and dethrone them. But that person wasn't really the underdog, right? That person had been training their entire life, watching tapes of Federer, watching tapes of Sampras, watching tapes of Djokovic, learning their style and studying everything they do so that they could get a chance to win. So they're not exactly underdogs, they're trained athletes. But we are so addicted to it, and it's everywhere. The repetition in our society is to automatically root for the underdog, and we should not be doing that. Now that we're not raised from the Bible anymore, now you and I are, but people who are not raised in the Bible, they're raised by sci-fi and sports, we just get addicted to this underdog thing. And I have it too. I thoroughly enjoy it when there's a come from behind victory and the like. Um, there's another trick to this too in our country, is there some people are self-loathing because we have all the power in our nation. They think that we are somehow just giant nefarious thing. That we're conditioned to favor the underdog at the same time that we are conditioned to automatically think the person with all the power is the bad guy. And that's the state of Israel right now. Israel was absolutely 100% the victim of the worst terrorist attack that I can imagine. And that's even after 9/11. They killed a lot more people on 9/11, but they did it abruptly with airplanes. On October the 7th, on Shemini Atzeret, for those who don't know, that it happened on the 8th day of a pilgrimage festival. So there were all kinds of people from all over the world in Israel rejoicing and relaxing on one of God's high Sabbaths. And the Hamas terrorists paratrooped in and broke into Israel for the specific purpose of killing women, children, elderly, and treating them horribly and taking them hostage. And so Israel has to fight back against that. They have to, and Israel has IDF, and they have all the weapons, and they have all the drones, and they have all the power, and they are the good guy. Well, they're a flawed nation, right? So let's just scratch that off the list right now. You stop saying that because they're a flawed nation that somehow they deserve it or something like that. That's terrible. Terrible thinking, because then as you judge, you will be judged. You set up a standard that nobody can meet, and we're all just condemned to die. But we're not. We're not condemned to die. We're commanded to do justice, to love righteousness, to help the widow, to help the elderly, and sometimes that takes one of these. Sometimes you have to protect people by force, and that's what Israel is doing. Hamas may be lesser in number and lesser in power, but they may be the underdog, but they deserve to be the dead dog. They deserve to be eradicated for the demonic satanic attacks that they continue to lead and say that given a chance they will do it again. And so we have good guys. The world has good guys, and the good guys have power. Sometimes the good guys have power, and sometimes they don't have power. But here is something that I want you to consider. We're going to get back into the Bible. Is Numbers 22, 3 and 4. So Moab was in great fear because of the people, for they were numerous. And Moab was in dread of the sons of Israel. Moab said to the elders of Midian, now this horde will lick up all that is around us as the ox licks up the grass of the field. and Balak, son of Zippor, was king of Moab at the time. A lot of people parallel the United States with ancient Israel. Guess what? So does this guy. Sometimes those parallels are just impossible to ignore. There are things that happen where Yahweh raised up a nation in Egypt that was the good guys. And they were deeply flawed, and they bit the hand that fed them. And that first generation died in the wilderness, and the second generation was raised up to do what? Do you understand? They were raised an army. They camped in a battle formation. They slept in a battle formation. They were organized in captains of thousands and tens and hundreds. They were organized from birth to be an invading, overwhelming army. And they were that. And when they crossed the Jordan, was Jericho the underdog? Yes. Did Jericho deserve to be defeated? Yes. In fact, Israel had so much power that Yahweh slowed them down so they on purpose so they wouldn't blitz the land of Canaan. Blitz it meaning take the whole thing at once and leave a bunch of land that went fallow and then go back to the wild beasts and whatever. Yahweh actually tempered Israel's invasion in pieces so that way the bad guys could continue managing the fields and managing the livestock until it was time for them to be fully exterminated. That's pretty macabre to think about, but that's what happened, and that is what is written. And so Israel was supposed to get cities that they did not build. So they slowly took that land as the good guys and an overwhelming force that was flawed. Now, I talk about parallels between the United States and Israel. There's another parallel here. And there's another parallel that is astonishingly astute. And one of the reasons why we read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, because what's going to happen is based on what's happened before. And there's a foreshadowing with the Israelite army that came from through the 40 years in the wilderness. And before I get to that, 1 Samuel 17:47 says, "For the battle is the Lord's," is the last half of it. "For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." If Yahweh's on your side, you're never the underdog. You're always the always the overwhelming force. But in Revelation, you can't see it because my little person bulb there. Revelation 6:12 through 17 is a direct parallel with the Israelite army. "I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Then the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the commanders, and the rich, and the strong, and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves among the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and to the rocks, Fall on us from the presence of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" You understand, when Yeshua comes back, he is not the underdog. When Satan fell, he took a third of the angels with him. That left 2/3, and they're coming. And they're coming with an incredible, overwhelming force, and the underdog is Satan. And we've been conditioned to do what? We've been conditioned to love the underdog and give deference to the underdog. Could that be part of this end times falling away? It's a pretty intriguing way of thinking, isn't it? Mankind is going to be hiding in the rocks because of their idolatry and their sin. Just like how Israel was hiding in the rocks in the days of Gideon. Do you see the value in reading the entire Bible and learning from it? And so, could it be part of Satan's plan of conditioning to get mankind to go up and fight against Jerusalem? Because he's going to come up at the end of the 1,000 years as a victim. He's got people thinking that the Islamic terrorists are the victim today. The people who wake up in the morning thinking about murdering Jews and Christians, who go about that business all day and go to sleep at night praying to their God that they get to kill Christians and Jews. That those are the victims, all right? Those are not the victims. The victims are the people who want to have free, open societies where people can have freedom of religion, freedom of association. That's the best we're going to do on this side of the kingdom, brothers and sisters. I know it's easy to find fault, and it's easy to say, oh, we're evil, or we're this and that and the other. But do you really want the alternative? I don't know. But understand, when we see Yeshua return with overwhelming force, that means the good guys have finally arrived. I want to thank you for watching. Please drop in at firstcenturychristianity.net. Give us a follow, give us a like, give us a share, and come to church. Come and worship with us on Saturdays at 1 p.m. Central in the Kansas City area or on Zoom. May Yahweh bless you and keep you in the name of his son Yeshua. Bye-bye.